our analogy was we were watching Sonic 3, and Sonic's told to follow his heart, right? And our kids are like, spot the lie. Like they're starting to get this game now. Okay, spot the lie. And some kids like money, some kids like candy. You just figure out what.
Sure.
But we're like, yeah, good job, you caught that. It's interesting. They don't tell Shadow, who's the bad guy in the movie, they don't tell him follow his heart. His heart's not good, but for some reason, Sonic says it's
Interesting.
good. So that lets us start unpacking some of that. So what is our standard? Like, who should we follow? Oh, Jesus. We should follow his standard. Well, how do we get that? Well, we read our Bibles, and we're constantly reminded of that because we want to drift so that our ways become his ways.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to Dare to Raise Daniels. I'm very excited about our guest today. The cool thing about the Christian world is that it is very diverse, and there are people from every walk and aspect, and they are serving and loving Jesus. And today I have with me Dr. Benjamin Shaw. Hello, Dr. Benjamin Shaw. It's good to see you, sir. And one of the cool things is he's an apologist, but one of the other cool things is he played hockey and actually went to college playing hockey, which is very fascinating because I cannot play hockey, but I watch it on TV, so I know so much about it, but not really. Well, welcome, Dr. Shaw. How are you today?
Hey, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. And yep, I went to school just to play hockey. That was my whole reason for going to school was so I could play hockey. So, and it was Liberty had an ice rink on campus, and that's what got me there.
Wow. Well, there's actually a young man in our church who is really good, and he has scholarship offers, which is amazing because we're way down in Texas. He's actually from Ohio, but I will definitely, no matter what happens, I'll send him this and say, "Hey, I was thinking of you when I talked to Dr. Shaw." So tell us just your brief story. How did you get from where you started to where you are today?
Yeah, so I'm from Fort Lauderdale, Florida originally. And long story short, I ended up playing hockey. I started when I was in high school, so I started pretty late. But I played every single day. I practiced every day. I refed hockey, so even my job was hockey. And I ended up going to Connecticut for a couple years to play junior hockey there. And it was cold, and there was snow, and you got to start your car and all this stuff. And I was like, oh wow, this is different. Um, I don't know of any of the teams that'll make up here. And like even at the time, Quinnipiac, they didn't even have their own rink on campus,
Wow.
which I thought was strange. They do now, but and I wasn't going to make Quinnipiac. I just want, so I'm clear
Sure.
about that. They were a very good team, but um, I was like, well, if I'm not going to have my own rink, I might as well go back to Florida where it's warm. And I played for FAU for a year, and then someone told me about Liberty, and I saw the rink, and I saw the picture of the rink. Just got built in 2006, so I applied and I got accepted, and within like 3 weeks, I was at Liberty. So that's what got me there. And then I made the team, and I found out the former hockey coach. I met him, and it turns out he's the world's leading expert on Jesus' resurrection. That's Gary Habermas. And so that's
Wow.
how I got kind of connected with that. But I also got to ask questions I had about Jesus and theology and the Bible and all those sorts of things that I had growing up, but didn't have a lot of people to talk to or trusted to take those questions seriously.
That's interesting. Part of the reason I've chosen the career that I have also is because as a kid, I had questions about Jesus and I was afraid to ask. And I'm like, you know what? Someday when I'm a big kid, I'm going to figure out these answers and I'll tell other kids. So let's just say I'm a big kid and I'm working on telling other kids the answers. So that leads us right into tell us what you do.
Yep. So I partnered with a ministry called Core Apologetics. We relaunched about a year and a half ago, so we're pretty new. It was originally a ministry that was meant to help deal with doubts and help doubters, so a doubters ministry. And I was talking to the founder of it, and we were just kind of talking one day, and he goes, "Hey, I had a crazy idea. Why don't you join with me, and we do something a lot more than just dealing with doubt, but we can also help equip believers, help them major on the majors or core truths of Christianity. So, core apologetics, that's what we want to focus on. We want to help people major on the majors so they're not getting um, consumed with like secondary or tertiary topics. And so, because if we can't get the main thing right, why are we on the second and third thing? So, I really like that. and I didn't like I felt like I had to go to grad school to get questions answered, and I was like, oh, this shouldn't be the case. How do we get what's in school out of the school into the churches, into different organizations, and things like that? Because just one example is like business owners will speak to 10 times more non-believers and nominal Christians than pastors. So how do we help equip them, especially if you've got, business owners or employees, at your church where they've got families, they've got full-time jobs, they are serving, but like they're not going to go to seminary, they're not going to go to grad school to get this extra. So how can we help equip them? So those are some of the things um, we're trying to help fill that gap there.
Okay. So you mentioned core, and what would you say are the primary issues that your average Christian should be familiar with? Doesn't mean they have to have a PhD or
Right.
graduate
Yeah.
level, but just, hey, I have I know a little bit about this. I can respond.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I taught some classes at Colorado Christian University, and one of the things this I would have the students do is do a survey of two non-believers, two believers, and a pastor of what are the biggest objections to Christianity. Because you want to know, what do the believers think that those objections are, but then what do
Sure.
non-believers think those objections are too? And there was a common theme. There's four common ones, and then I'll just add a fifth. That's kind of a one we've been talking about lately. But the first one's the problem of evil. Why is there evil in the world? Though that one isn't quite as popular as it used to be because it's people are saying, well, if there's evil, then there must be good, and a moral law that differentiates between the two, and a moral lawgiver that helps. So that's one of the things. So that's and free will and discussions of that nature. Those all play into that. So and there's good answers there. Another one. These are two kind of semi-related questions. This would be more the area I would go down. The reliability of the New Testament, is it reliable? And did the resurrection happen? So those are two kind of intertwined questions. A third one is how do we know Christianity is true compared to other worldviews? So we see, and I'm from Fort Lauderdale, so there's millions of different worldviews. And so that was a question I would ask. And so some people either go, oh, they're all wrong, or some people go, oh, they're all right. And both of those are the wrong
Right.
paths to go. And then the fourth one is not really an objection, it's just more a statement, which we would agree with is Christian hypocrisy. So that's another one. And then the last one is, does it work? Does it really work? Does it make an impact in our culture, in our lives, in our families, and things like that?
Okay. Wow, that's pretty good. So we have evil, free will, why is the world such a messed up place? The reliability of the New Testament, and did the resurrection actually happen? Is Christianity true compared to other religions? If so, why are there so many hypocrites inside the church or people professing Christianity? And finally, does it work?
Hmm.
So I'm going to ask you, would you be willing to pick one of those and just give us the elevator speech on uh, what you would tell someone if they asked you that question?
Yeah, we'll go with the resurrection because that's the cornerstone of Christianity, and we're coming up on Easter season, so that's probably the
Perfect.
best one to do. Plus, I mentioned Habermas being the world's leading scholar on the resurrection. Um, so yeah, I'm trying to think of how to frame the entire discussion because there's levels at which you can approach the discussion, and I'll unpack that in a minute. I'll approach it the way I did. I was a marketing major and I took a class called Christian Evidences, and I read this book called The Case for the Resurrection. And I got introduced to some of the historical evidence for the resurrection, and it was incredible. So, the case for the resurrection, and Gary Habermas in particular, he's developed what's called the minimal facts approach. And basically, he looks at the evidence for the resurrection and does so in such a way where if you believe the Bible is inerrant and inspired, we're going to get a resurrection. If you think the Bible is reliable, but maybe it's got some errors, you're going to get a resurrection. And if you think it's full of errors and uninspired, you're going to get a resurrection. I was like, oh, it's a pretty good method. Um, and now, what does he mean? What does he mean by that? So he's not saying it's true because the Bible says so, right? Because we have people from across those spectrums. But we're using historical method and looking at the past the way we would any other ancient document or claim or anything like that. And we're going to look at the resurrection data. And when we do that, we find that there's some minimal facts, they're called minimal facts, that are one, they're very highly evidenced. So multiple lines of historical, critical argumentation for each of them. And then second, they're widely agreed upon by scholars of different backgrounds. You know, those three categories,
Sure.
all those categories, they could be Jewish, agnostic, atheist. These are facts they're going to agree upon. So it's like, oh, that sounds like a great approach, a nice common ground approach. Let's start with where we agree, and then we can kind of move out. Now, what's really neat is the minimal facts most of us already know. So there was no learning new facts for me because most people know Jesus died on the cross. They know the disciples had experiences of the risen Jesus. And they know the disciples were willing to suffer and die for their faith. They know that Paul persecuted the church and then became a believer and follower of Jesus after an experience with the risen Jesus. And then a lesser known fact, two lesser known ones, is going to be James, Jesus' brother. He was a skeptic during Jesus' lifetime, but then became a believer and the leader in the church in Jerusalem. And then the other is that all those facts are recorded very, very early. So I wasn't counting, but that's like 5, 6 facts. We all know most of those, but each of those facts is highly, highly evidenced. And so the case for the resurrection does a really good job at introducing some of these facts. It actually only does 5 of them, and demonstrates how strong they are, their wide acceptance, why they're accepted. Because if there's multiple reasons of evidence for them, it makes sense that scholars are going to agree to it, right, from all backgrounds. So that was really powerful for me. But then to see how alternative theories fail to account for those facts, that was equally powerful. So I was like, not only is there a strong, powerful case for the resurrection, but alternative theories can't do it. And so I say that the case for the resurrection is just a great intro. But for the past decade or so, Dr. Habermas and I have been working on like putting together his life's work on Jesus's resurrection. So I've got 3 books right here. Each of those are about 1,000 pages each. And the first volume is just on historical evidence, and it's 1,000 pages.
Wow.
So you can get really, really deep if you want to. Or you could just stay at like a white. So I don't just do hockey, but I'm a black belt in jiu-jitsu. So I
Of
like using
course.
jiu-jitsu analogies. So that's like your black belt level. But like when you're just learning, you got to start. And the case for the resurrection was like where I learned to, be a blue belt, I guess you could say. But then the second volume is another 900 pages on responding to alternative theories. So there's a ton of information out there, but we can do it like we just did here in a short little elevator pitch style approach.
Okay. Well, very cool. So many questions I want to ask about hockey and jujitsu and apologetics at the same time. Like, how do you get the jersey over the person in apologetics in a nice way? No. All right. So, you mentioned alternative theories. So, for example, I know Islam kind of leans toward, he wasn't totally dead and he went on to be in India and so forth. How would you respond to one of those?
Yeah, because those are two different objections, whether Jesus went to India and Islam. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so the Islam one, there's a couple. What's interesting, Islam gives you a couple different responses. Um, the first one is Islam comes about 600 years later, and they say Jesus didn't die on the cross. The Gospels come a couple decades after. Paul's writing very soon after. We have an early Christian creed, which is dated to the early 30s AD, and Jesus was crucified in the 30s AD. So why would we ignore all these first century sources, all the second century sources, all the third century sources, and then go, you know what? When we get this later source here, centuries later, that's the right one. That's one of the arguments. And in fact, Ahmad Didat, he was a very well-known Muslim apologist. He says, yeah, that's the response you're going to get from Christians. And they have a good point. So he would acknowledge that's a good point. But their view of the Quran wouldn't let them They just had to say, that's a good point, but we still believe the Quran.
Sure,
And so some of the challenges, though, too, is well, the Quran affirms the teachings of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So how are we to understand that? And then a third point is you could also interpret the way the Quran describes Jesus's death is it's because it says the Jews thought they killed him, but they killed him not. Basically, meaning it wasn't the Jews that actually did it, but Allah had allowed it. Because there's other verses in the Quran that says um, there's a battle. I can't remember the reference off the top of my head, but there's a battle that goes on. Um, the army wins, but the credit goes to Allah. So we wouldn't say, oh, so that means the army didn't play any part in the battle? No, no, they did, but they didn't actually give the victory that was from Allah. So
sure,
that sort of interpretation could also be applied. So there's kind of like a three-prong approach to that. And that's just without me even having addressed any of the positive evidence except for like the earliness of the sources. There's um, some other good arguments like the Strauss critique, and Strauss was a you don't expect to get some Germans from the 1800s, but he's provided what's been one of the strongest critiques to the theory that Jesus didn't die on the cross, and he was a skeptic. There's a medical evidence for Jesus's death on the cross. We've actually collected a number of different medical sources that all give different descriptions on how and why they think Jesus died. And so by far the most common view is that Jesus died by asphyxiation on the cross. So there's a number of different elements that you can unpack here too.
sure. So, thank you for that, by the way. Um, I guess my next question would be in the same vein, but changing gears, if that's even possible. So you mentioned that what sent you down this road is that you had questions, and then later you discovered that you weren't really able to get answers until you were at the graduate level, and you wanted to disperse that out to everyone. And so I think of kids today, um, and obviously, yes, times have changed, but they're probably similar questions. What were some of the questions that you had that you were looking for answers?
My questions weren't that deep. So I wasn't discipled after I got saved for a long time. So I was trying to figure out who Corinth was. Who was this guy?
Yes,
Apparently, it's a city, so I had to learn that. And then I learned Paul was the author of that. So I didn't know Paul wrote half the New Testament. I had questions on who were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. How did the Bible come together? Things like that. What about different worldviews? What do they like? How are they different? How are we like? Um, how does Christianity different? And evidence is a major part of that discussion,
sure.
aside from the philosophical and theological teachings and the worldview itself. So those were some of the questions that I had, but I just didn't know anyone else asking them or talking about them. Not that I would have got shunned or anything for it, but just
Right.
there was uninterest, and maybe I had some unserious friends too at the time, and I played some of that was probably me playing hockey, but I had some of those questions prior to that. Um, but I didn't really see a lot of people talking about it. But we grew up. I'm assuming we here. We grew up without the internet. We had AOL starting, and most
Yes,
people.
I remember.
So that
That
was
dial-up.
yeah, yeah, and that was like right around the end of middle school, and no, that's high school too. I guess I don't know. So that's late '90s, early 2000s.
So, I'll just side note, I encourage parents if you are looking for answers, I do check got questions every now and then, and it's a biblical typically good answers. So let me give you a little illustration. I ran into a family that I had known from a long time ago, and they were catching me up on their son who had a child, and he was now 10. And so they just expressed that they were really worried about him, and that he said, very scientific minded young man. He wants to see it, Thomas, touch it, feel it. And he said, yeah, I mean, you guys make me go to church. They tell me Bible stories. But how do I really know there's a God? And if there is a God, which then goes into is Christianity true? How do I know that he's the Christian God? And so if someone, once again, you have your 1,000-page tomes behind you, but this is a 10-year-old. Where would you start with a 10-year-old who's like, well, this was my question. Who made God? I'm like, who made God? Okay, so
Yeah.
so we're saying God made everything and God did it, but then it's like, how does somebody get so amazing that's outside of the box? And so that's where my mind just
Yeah,
would.
yeah, those are good questions, and one of the responses I remember that's just stuck with me to that. It's kind of like asking for the first whole number before one. It's like, I can ask for that, but it's kind of the question doesn't make sense because there is no
Sure.
whole integer um, before one. So that's part of it. Because when we're talking about cosmology, and you're not gonna, you can use that word to see your kids say it, which would be funny. Um, try to pronounce that word. But we're talking about origins and things like that. The common arguments and discussions for the creation of the universe, because we talk about Genesis 1 and in the beginning God said. So God's not a created being, whereas everything else is created. So that's the difference. Created beings have something that create them, but God's uncreated. So we can't ask who created God because he's not a created being in that same way. So those are some of the distinctions. Now, and then you got to figure out how to, approach that to your child, depending on, like you said, are they scientifically inclined, philosophically inclined, relationally inclined, and things like that. Um, but even those discussions on does God exist, there's a book out. Now, this one's a little heady, but there's other ones very similar to it. But it's called 2 dozen or so arguments for God's existence. 2 dozen, that's a pretty good, that's a lot of
Yes.
arguments, right? Um, and then it also helps to pull in contrasts. So you can pull a contrast in. So how many arguments are there for atheism, for example? Like what's a positive argument for atheism that yields the conclusion God does not exist? And that's a very big burden of proof. So trying to get to things like that, you can help shine that, difference between we've got these building blocks over here for God's existence. And I'll just use an analogy or a related story. Because you mentioned got questions, the founder of Wikipedia recently has said he's either become a Christian or he's very open to it. And when he
Interesting.
was a young teenager, he had questions, but he got scolded for having questions and kind of talked down on. So he left the faith for about 30 years. But he got
Wow.
a PhD in philosophy and was a teacher of philosophy and started Wikipedia at the same time, I guess. And he describes how he was looking at all the different evidence, the 2 dozen or so arguments for God's existence, and goes, the cumulative weight of all of those is powerful. It's profound. Antony Flew was a famous atheist back a generation ago, and Habermas had debated him a number of times. He became a theist as well because of the evidence, and for him, it was the amount of complexity in our universe, especially DNA. So you can look at these things from a big picture or a small picture. By the way, the founder of Wikipedia also mentioned that when he looked at the Bible, he found really good answers to the questions he had there as well. So it's not just God, because that can mean a number of things. But then when we look at specifically the Christian God, uh, especially the resurrection is the key for all of this. Because even Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, our faith is in vain. So the resurrection, that's why I mentioned, this is why I would lead with this, because if we have the resurrection, we can, with a lot less anxiety, look at all these other questions.
Sure.
So starting there, keeping that the main thing is a great place to begin, and then you can start doing these others. And some people debate, this is a kind of an interesting debate, but do you need to show God's existence before you go to the resurrection? Or does the resurrection itself show that there's a God because that event would necessitate a God to happen? So that's kind of a different thing. But yeah, so I think those are helpful. And then as far as like parents go, your kids are going to have questions. Make sure you're answering them, but living them out too, and setting a good model for them. So reading your making sure you're living out what you say.
Right. So that takes me into, your typical parent that's listening to this podcast most likely is saying, "Hey, I'm listening to it because A, I want encouragement, that I'm doing the right thing, and then B, I want to raise my kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And I have
Yeah.
my curricula, I have my, our Bible time, and I need encouragement that I'm going in the right direction. A, what would be an encouragement you could give them? And then also, just like a ship is heading across the ocean, the slightest adjustment of the rudder makes it maybe head in this way or that way. As they're heading in a good direction, what would you say could fine tune their direction in a really good way? Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
We'll see. We'll see if my answer makes as much sense. Yeah, because we mentioned both of us. We homeschool, so we do as well, and um, there's just different levels to it. So part of it is the consistency in our own life because they're going to see and recognize whether we're doing what we say we do or we're being inconsistent. So we want to make sure we're doing that. We want to model for them things that we're going to want from them. And that there's areas where I didn't do very good growing up, but I want them to do good. So it's easy for me to be like, oh, well, you didn't do that growing up. I'm like, yeah,
Right.
but I want better for them. I want them
Yes.
to be better than I was. So reminding myself of that. When the kids have questions, and they should have questions. 80% of believers have unresolved questions. So creating a culture of communication is really important, where they feel comfortable because they're going to ask questions. Their friends are going to ask questions, and so you want them to be prepared. And actually, since I just said that, Gen Z, 52% of Gen Z is motivated to learn about Jesus, not just interested, merely interested. They're motivated to learn about Jesus. The number one trustworthy source for them that they think is reliable is a Christian Gen Z. So,
Oh my.
yes. So the question then is, how equipped are these Christian Gen Zs to address those sorts of questions? Like, why do you believe the Bible? Why do you guys go to church? Is Jesus God? Like, those are questions that their friends are going to ask them.
Yeah.
And I spoke with someone not too long ago. And he asked his mom one day, like, why do you believe the Bible? And she gave a nice, I think I'm not saying this is a wrong answer, but she's just like, well, I just believe it. And so she has, life to have tested against the Bible. So she's seen experientially, it's proved itself time and time again. He's young. He doesn't have that luxury, right?
Right. Right.
So that led him to go, well, why is it trustworthy? Why is it? So then he started looking into some of these questions, and now he's gone down a PhD path as well. But just because he wants to understand, why is the Bible reliable? Oh, well, we've got good sources. They're early. They're associated with eyewitnesses. Paul was a persecutor of the church, and he wrote like half the New Testament. That's significant. Like, why would like something happen there? So those are all good indications of reliability. Um, but that also helps us because those are the questions that people who didn't grow up in the Bible Belt or in a church culture, they're going to ask because in those areas, people go to church not because they have to, but because they want to. And so there's a difference between tradition and doing things out of tradition and teaching. So trying to if you're going to have those guides, we want to be teaching, hey, this is what we're doing, and then this is why we're doing it. There's a reason to it. We're not just doing it for the sake of it.
Right. Okay, so you mentioned be an example, keep the lines of communication, and that 52% of Gen Zers want to know, and they want to know from a Christian who's actually desiring to live it
Yeah.
out.
Let me give
Uh,
two more. Let me give two more
yes,
because you just gave those bullet points. Reading your Bible every day.
yes.
The Center for Biblical Engagement. You can put that in the notes or somewhere, but put a link to them. There is incredible research on what happens in the lives of believers when they're reading their Bible at least 4 times a day. And that was
Four
something
times a day or 4 times a
or
week?
sorry, 4 times a week. I'm sorry,
Sure,
four
sure.
times a week. But you want to do it 7 times. And I'll often say, um, for us, today's Thursday when we're doing this. I hope you've taken more than one shower this week. I have.
Yes,
Same way with reading our Bibles. We don't want to walk around stinky. Well, we don't want to spiritually stink either. So we want to be reading our Bible every day because when we're out in the world, the lies and deception they're starting to work. But we want our mind, Romans 12:2, we want to be transformed and have our mind renewed, and we do that through daily reading of Scripture to help keep God's ways before us, and we be like, oh, I'm starting to drift here. So that will help bring us back, but got to do that daily. Um, and so that's one way. And then The other is just making sure too to take time and study some of these things. If this is what my kids encountering with questions, well, let me study them. Let me take some time to dig into them. And so doing that is something else that can be done. It's kind of like here's my analogy. Uh, I'm from a big city, so I don't have a lot of like camping skills. So, but now I'm in Virginia, and those are important skills to have. So I've got to do a little extra research and start trying to figure out, okay, how do we do this? What's a good tent? Is this a good, and all that kind of stuff. But this is even much more important, these topics. So those are I guess five things I think that are would be helpful to do.
I was just going to mention on the questions. One time I heard a professor say that, questions are imagine a sheet and you're trying to understand what's on the other side and you don't know, and you're poking pinpricks in that sheet with your questions, and slowly light begins to come out. And the more pinpricks that you put in, the more light comes through. I thought that was kind of fascinating, especially on something you were just clueless on.
That's hilarious because that is a professor analogy. My mind is just thinking that's battleship. That's just battleship.
Yeah, well, battleship works. Eventually, you just keep firing missiles over the top. You've seen the movie, and obviously, if you're from my generation, you really liked it. All right. Well, so I typically ask guests for a parenting hack. Do you have a parenting hack that can just give parents some practical advice along the way?
Yeah, this is a great one. We got from Thaddeus Williams, and he's got a book called "Don't Follow Your Heart," and it's an excellent book. Thaddeus Williams has a number of good books, and in the book, he starts off with a story about a game he plays with his kids, and it's called Spot the Lie. So when they're watching movies or listening to music, if they spot the lie, he gives them some sort of reward. So we started doing that at our house too. So because it's just such a great game, because then they're starting to realize, okay, we have a we're shaping our biblical worldview, but our movies, 99% of them don't have that. So we can understand how to engage the world, and they're going to have a different worldview, but that's not, we're going to see things that aren't true. And so, like, our analogy was we were watching Sonic 3, and Sonic's told to follow his heart, right? And our kids are like, spot the lie. Like, they're starting to get this game now. Okay, spot the lie. And, some kids like money, some kids like candy, you just figure out.
Sure.
But we're like, yeah, good job, you caught that. It's interesting. They don't tell Shadow, who's the bad guy in the movie, they don't tell him follow his heart. His heart's not good, but for some reason, Sonic says
Interesting.
good. So that lets us start unpacking some of that. So what is our standard? Like, who should we follow? Oh, Jesus, we should follow his standard. Well, how do we get that? Well, we read our Bibles, and we're constantly reminded of that because we want to drift so that our ways become his ways instead of his ways becoming our ways. And so that's one great tip. We like doing it. It's a lot of fun too. It just helps us think and talk through these issues.
I love it. I can see though you have an outreach opportunity. You bring your neighbor over and they're telling the story and they're like, I got it, Dad. You're like, no, no, not at this point. No. No, that is actually great. I have not heard of that, and it's something I'd like to try because we just watched Sonic 3 as well.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anything you want to add before we wrap it up? Like, oh yeah, everybody needs to know this.
Yeah. Let me just share, I guess, about our ministry
Yeah.
because we are trying to do all those things so people don't have to go to grad school and spend thousands of dollars in grad school. We're trying to help equip churches and organizations and individuals get equipped with these core truths, or so that they can one either become better, stronger, more mature disciples, so that they can help disciple others at their church or their own kids. But also, you have people who have questions, so we want to help minister to them. And sometimes doubts are questions, sometimes doubts are doubts, and you want to sort those out. And in line kind of with what you just asked, one important thing to note about questions, and this is good for your kids or with someone who's struggling with doubts or questions, there's three categories you can classify them. There's factual doubts, there's emotional doubts, and there's volitional doubts. Factual is just like, did Jesus die on the cross? Okay, how do we know? And there's typically no pain associated with that question. An emotional doubt is like, well, what if Jesus didn't die on the cross? What if he didn't? What if, like, it usually starts with a what if. And typically, if someone, if it's an emotional question like that, an equally valid response to that, that should help negate some of the emotional anxiety that comes with that is, well, what if he did die on the cross? So if you can go what if one way, we can go what if the other way. And then the third is volitional, which is like, I don't care. I just don't care. And so that takes a different type of approach as well. But understanding those is helpful. And so we unpack all those different things. We have different, like, so I've taught online and I feel like a glorified moderator in our classes. And if you've taken online classes, if you're homeschooling too, you know there's modules and sometimes there's discussion boards. Those are particularly tough for everybody involved. So we wanted to do something that would be better for the professors and better for the students. We have webinars that we do. They're 6 weeks long. They're taught live, just like we're doing now. So if there's a question, you can ask it. I may ask you a question like, hey, what were some of those minimal facts we talked about earlier? And because you want to, the jujitsu analogy, you want to roll here so when we get out into the world, it's not the first time. And so we have classes on New Testament reliability. We've got webinars. There's no homework. Okay,
Phew.
there's a book we read with it, but it's a webinar, and they're 6 weeks long. They're 1 hour, and we record them in case you miss. We know people go on vacation, but it allows some people to listen while they're on their treadmill. We have one finance guy who him and his 13-year-old son take the class together, and they just listen in. And so that's something that people do. So I said class, webinar. I meant webinar. And but we go through right now we're going through 13 arguments for the reliability of the New Testament.
Okay.
About two a week. We have the week after Easter, we have a resurrection court webinar coming up where we're going to unpack the minimal facts in a lot more detail, and as well as the significance for today, because for me it's very encouraging and motivating in that the resurrection gives great meaning and significance to our lives today in what we do. Our actions have eternal significance because of the resurrection. And so we talk about that. We also have one on dealing with doubt, and we have one on worldviews and discipleship, where we kind of, okay, how do we distinguish Christianity? What's the gospel? What does it mean to be a disciple? Because if a lot of people, if you ask them, at least according to Barna, if you ask them what's a disciple, they're not quite sure from a biblical point of view. And so, like, they'll say, follow Jesus. Okay, great. Well, what's that mean? It means honor him. Okay, great. What's that mean? It means give him glory. Okay, what does that like?
Love
Those are
your
nice
neighbor.
words.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but what does that mean? How do we unpack that? So we try to unpack that with husbands and wives, parenting, um, finances. Jesus speaks a lot on finances, but we're just touching on them, right? Because we're
Sure.
just there to introduce them. We're just trying to help point to those things. And then as you're reading scripture daily, you get more and more familiar. So
Okay.
those are some things we're doing. We do some events and stuff like that too, but Core Apologetics is the name of our ministry. We're pretty new, so we're growing. We're trying to do a lot. We've got some exciting plans. And an Ask Me curriculum. I almost forgot. We're developing an Ask Me curriculum because of all those questions.
Okay. And so on the webinars, what is your target audience? You said a dad and
Oh,
a
a
13-year
great
old.
question. Yes, we've had high school students
Okay.
to high-powered attorneys to heart surgeons to retirees. It's
Okay.
everybody.
Okay.
Because I also, so I teaching jujitsu, you've got black belts in the class and you can have white belts, and you want to teach in such a way that everyone is stretched a little bit. And so that's what we try. We try to have that same approach, because a lot of these are questions. Just because you might be a heart surgeon doesn't mean that you took any classes on the Bible or the New
Sure.
Testament or how it came together. So, for a lot of us, it's starting there and then going. And then if people are more interested and want to study more and God's calling them to graduate school, oh, great, here, go to the school. We can point you to some schools. Uh,
Okay.
but most of us are just wanting to be more faithful in our daily lives, do the good works God's prepared beforehand for us to walk in, and those sorts of things. And so we want to help give them the grounding so that they can live in the reality of the resurrection and then be disciples in their disciplines, whatever that may be.
Well, very cool. Well, Dr. Benjamin Shaw, I really appreciate your time and your wisdom, and I will put the information in the notes. And my prayer is that parents and kids and Christians would disciple others with knowledge, but it doesn't have to be exhaustive, but just heading in a direction. So thank you so much for your time. Just pray a blessing on you and your family. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We'll be with you again next week. God bless. See you soon.